This is what you've been waiting for. The true star power is about to collide and burst into a big bang here on the Satoshi Phoenix stage. Our next speakers need no introduction. We bring to you Glen Weyl, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Vitalik Buterin, and Audrey Tang.
Hey everybody. Hi. First of all, I just want to thank everybody here and thank Audrey for inviting me to be here in Taiwan. It's my first time in this country. I've been here for a few days with my family. I'm so happy to be here and really enjoying my time, so thank you for having me here. My name is Joe. I figured I think probably everyone here in this room knows who we are, but for those watching at home or on video, I'll just say for a second, my name's Joe. I'm an actor, I'm a filmmaker. I also started an online community called Hit Record, which is for creative collaboration. Do you guys want to just introduce yourselves really briefly for those who might not know?
Sure. I'm Audrey Tang. I served for almost 8 years as Taiwan's digital minister. And now I graduated, and I'm now a senior fellow at Project Liberty.
I'm Glen Weyl. I'm a recovering economist, and I work at Microsoft when I'm not on sabbatical like I am now. And much of my life is devoted to telling the story of Audrey and plurality in Taiwan.
So I'm Vitalik. I'm founder of the Ethereum project and also a longtime collaborator of Glen and the plurality community. I'm so happy to be here.
All right, so I'm going to start off just by saying one of the first things that strikes me when I read the Plurality book is a sense of optimism. I like to consider myself an optimist, but if I'm really honest, I, as well as maybe a lot of people all over the world, it seems, have found myself sinking down into a bit of pessimism more and more. I don't know if that's because of the pandemic. I don't know if that's because of social media and the constant onslaught of negativity that we see. We'll talk about that more later. I don't know what it is necessarily, but in being exposed to these new ideas of plurality, I find myself refreshed with a sense of optimism. And so that's the first thing I want to ask you all is, Audrey, Glen, what makes you optimistic in today's world?
Yeah, 10 years ago in Taiwan, the trust level between our citizens and the administration and the democratic process was around 9%. So it wasn't very high 10 years ago. And there was rampant polarization. And again, a lot of it can be attributed to the kind of incoming social media, negativity, polarization.
Polarization, as an American, I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay, right, of course, right. But as I mentioned, we, instead of censoring anything, instead of doubling down on lockdown or things like that, we instead cultivated this idea of civic participation, of making sure that people, even younger than 18, have full means to participate in policy making, citizens' initiatives, and so on. Nowadays, I think by this year, the trust level is easily above 60%. According to the International Civics and Citizen ICCS test, our 15 years olds are ranked top of the world when it comes to the feeling of agency, feeling that they're a full citizen, even before they turn 18, of the participation and so on. So over the course of 10 years, there's no one single policy, no one single intervention from the civil society or from the government or from the industries that like solves this problem, but there's a very incremental effort toward a very strong conviction that if we collaborate across diversity and see diversity and conflict that came from diversity as a strength, as energy, then we can overcome this initial low trust, high polarization condition. So this is a lived experience that gives me optimism.
I love what you say that kind of difference can be energy and strength as opposed to sickness dragging me down. That is optimistic. Glen, optimism?
You know, the more I see of people who describe themselves either as optimistic or pessimistic, the less I want to be either. The problem with optimism and pessimism is optimism basically says you're going to like what you're going to get, and pessimism says you're not, you're going to get what you don't want. And neither of them really give you much choice or agency or participation. Audrey was born with a heart condition that meant that if she got agitated or angry, she might die until the age of 12. Does that leave one optimistic? Does that leave one pessimistic? I think maybe it leaves one strong and resilient and ready to pivot and meet challenges and survive. And I think that's what I want. I want our societies to be ones that don't wait around for things to happen to them, that take responsibility and agency.
Can we just jog back for a second? This condition, that sounds like a fairy tale. I mean, it's so literary. Can you tell me more about what that's actually like? Is that real or is he exaggerating?
Well, it's VSD is one of the most common congenital heart conditions. And so I was told when I was 4 years old or so that I may have this 50% chance to survive until I get a surgery, which I did get when I was 12. But it essentially meant that for the first core personality of my kind of forming years, I had to learn this Taoist breathing and things like that to keep my heartbeat below a certain level, because above a certain level, it's kind of beyond the capacity of my heart. And now, I think exactly as Glen said, this is not about optimism, because if I get too overjoyed, too excited, then actually I also faint, right? And so this is more about moderation in all things and just facing things as they come instead of just amplifying it to too much optimism or too much extreme pessimism.
Can I just stay on this for one more second because it's kind of fascinating. When was the last time, has that happened any time in your recent life where you were so excited one way or the other, positively or negatively, that you did faint? What happened?
Yeah, so I did, after the surgery, try to get some roller coaster experience and almost immediately kind of pass out very quickly. And certainly not because of my heart condition, but because of my kind of psychological reaction to it. But no, when I was a young child, that was a very frequent phenomenon. Like if I just exercise too much or become too upset or things like that, like my face would just turn purple and I would just find myself waking up in the hospital.
In Taoism, which was very important to Audrey's mastering the challenges that she faced, there's very much this idea of balance. And I think we see this, the United States, I think many would say, coming out of the Cold War, had it pretty good. Things were on a pretty good trajectory, whatever. And then because things were good, because there wasn't a lot going on, a lot of problems crept up in that society because people didn't have things to give them meaning. Something similar happened before the First World War. That was one of the most prosperous periods in human history. And people, they needed problems. The problems weren't there. And Taiwan has had a lot of challenges, some would say, in recent years. And so they found solutions. So that's why I really find this optimism, pessimism thing really misplaced. It's not about just affect towards, your helpless future. It's about your ability to maintain discipline and calm and purposeful moral action in the face of whatever comes at you.
Vitalik, you wrote a post called My Techno-Optimism, which was sort of in response perhaps to Silicon Valley's dominant philosophy, I guess maybe one could say, of techno-optimism. So how is your techno-optimism different from that of what you're contrasting with in Silicon Valley?
I mean, I think the big kind of overarching theme is basically that I'm like more specific about like what kinds of technologies I'm excited about, and like what kinds of technologies that like I want to actually see pushed forward the most, right? And I think I mean, as I described in that post, right, like one of the big places where like I'm not willing to hop on the 100% acceleration train that like people like Mark and Jason are, is basically like the AI, right? And basically, like asking the question, like, if we actually are at a place where we're potentially only 5 or 10 years away from, like shit hitting the fan in an extremely serious way, then like that's, like not something to like make, like jokes and like weird tweets about thermodynamics about, right? And so that, and one of the things that I thought at the time that like people really needed is like some kind of vision that is both not the what they would call the decel vision, the vision that like the best that we can possibly get for the world is like roughly what we have now, but maybe with less greed and more public healthcare. And at the same time, also not the vision that just like says humanity's destiny is like to go forward and let itself get replaced with whatever wins the natural selection game, even if it's like a big hypercube of silicon tiling the entire galaxy. And that's like there. Basically, like I think there was that missing space, right? That space of like a vision that is willing to be very optimistic about technology and seeing a lot of the positive potential, but where like at the same time, like there's ideas. So one of the core themes I had in the DIAC post is like basically this like defense and offense balance, right? Basically the difference between technologies that can make it easier for people to attack each other, and like which includes physical attacks. It can also include like attacking in very metaphorical ways, and technologies that make it easier to defend for people to defend each other. And one of the core like ideas I had is basically that like democratic and pluralistic society thrives best when like the defense side actually is stronger, right? And the analogy is like, well, like what is like every classical liberal's favorite country? It's basically Switzerland. What is Switzerland surrounded by? Basically impenetrable mountains, right? And so meanwhile, what's where do you see governance dystopias? And a lot of the time it's like these big vast expanses of like 2,000 kilometers of like pretty much empty space where like horse archers can just run across and no one can stop them, right? And so the question is like, well, can we like look at aspects of our world and like actually like try to make the the defense side of that equation more favorable, right? And that goes a lot beyond the physical, right? Like I think there's a lot of these discussions about the digital side of things, right? And on the digital side of things, there's I think it's become common to start analogizing, like social media as being this kind of war of all against all. And like it's basically this propaganda war of all of these like very powerful actors. And like the space for interactions that are like actually positive sum, and that like support things like collaboration and support things like truth seeking is not something that's like supported as well. And so the question is like, what if we like the difference between the physical world and the digital world is that the physical world is like kind of handed to us, but I mean, that's changing slowly, but like mostly, right? And the digital world is like, well, no, it's like we are the ones that are writing the code and the rules, right? And can we actually look at things like social media and like internet infrastructure and like actually, like write rules that like the basic structure of these platforms in a way that doesn't just like favor things that look like attacking. And like if we do that, like actually creates a lot more space for both this digital war of all against all to not happen, and for like very different visions that different people and different groups of people have to survive and thrive.
Joe, I've always wanted to challenge Vitalik a little bit on this. So I was wondering if
Go ahead,
give me
dude.
an opportunity. So I love what you're saying about not acceleration or deceleration, but steering. But I'm a little bit uncertain or confused about the defensive analogy. And let me give one abstract explanation, then one concrete example. So a lot of defensive technology, when I think about how it's employed, I think of vaults, private security guards, things that tend to entrench inequality. And to give more concrete example, what was probably the most important fundamental society shifting military technologies of the last 2,000 years in the West? It was, on the one hand, the development of armor and castles, which were basically defensive technologies, and then the development of gunpowder, which are offensive technologies. And there were pluses and minuses to each of these, but I think many would say that armor and castles kind of led to feudalism. It led to very capital-intensive things where a small group of people could gain a huge advantage by having the capital for defense, and therefore there was these very entrenched inequalities. And then when gunpowder arose, it actually changed the dynamic to one where like pretty much greater numbers won. And that had problems with it and whatever, but it like overall created kind of like liberal democracy.
Right.
So I don't know like that's a perfect example or that every example is like that, but I think my overall reaction thinking about things like that is I don't see a correlation between the term defensive in any simple way to interpret it and something that like is actually describing the like set of technological developments I think you'd like to see.
And I think if we like zoom in on like particular spaces, right? So like let's zoom in, for example, on internet security, right? So we have hackers. There's two different ways to protect against hackers, right? One way is that you basically try to create an internet where it's like not possible to do anything unless you're KYC'd, and like we like basically try to like go after each and every individual person like who tries to do something bad, right? The other approach that you can take is you can have like websites that are like websites, blockchains, like applications, whatever else that are like actually more secure natively, right? And I think if you like look at that specific example, then you see like the first approach basically like ends up leading to a lot of conflict, basically because like the approach for like it's basically leaning into the whole the best defense is a good offense thing. And whenever you have any kind of like disagreements, whenever you have like less than perfect consensus about how to apply that, like you start like it ends up both being perfect. It ends up often also being very unequal in certain different ways, right? So like one example in Ethereum, right, is like you had the DAO fork, but like would a DAO that was 100 times smaller realistically get a fork, right? And the answer is no. And meanwhile, if you can actually have like code that is like more like where you actually have stronger assurances that it reflects people's intent, then and that like it reflects people's desire to have things that can only be accessed in the ways that people think that they want it to be accessed, then like that's like you get a lot of those different downsides end up really
so it sounds like the defense that Vitalik means essentially depends on democratic coordination, or at least the distributed awareness that we're all in this together. Whereas obviously castles and armors and so on do not share that.
Yeah, I think like the big difference, right, is that with a castle is like you can't have one unless you have enough money to like basically like pay for like literally 10,000 people, and in like if we're talking about this like digital world, like a lot of the time the thing that I advocate is for basically this like one-time push to get a lot of like open source digital public goods created, so that once that technology exists, it becomes more available to everyone.
Which is essentially democratic. I like how you put that. It reminds me of the plurality symbol of that in a democracy, you've got these different voices, these different perspectives, and you have to find that Venn diagram in the middle, which is kind of what you're describing, Vitalik. Like there's this extreme end of the spectrum, which could be called accelerationists, and then there's the other extreme end of the spectrum, which could be called decelerationist or doomers or whatever you want to call it. But perhaps there's some kind of middle ground, that center of the Venn diagram, where like, let's be optimistic, or let's proceed, but proceed with wisdom and caution, as opposed to throwing caution to the wind. I mean, and that does sound like the heart of what a successful democracy can do. I want to talk about democracy because we're here in Taiwan, and Taiwanese democracy is really striking, especially to me as an American, where I think there's amongst the American people less faith in American democracy than there has ever been historically, which is sad to see. A lot of the plurality movement and a lot of what you write about in the book has to do with democracy. It reminds me of this one conversation I had with, and Vitalik, I was reminding you because I know you have a Russian background. I was having a conversation with a Russian cab driver one time, and we were talking about difference between Russia and the United States. We're talking about the difference between a democratic government versus an autocratic government. And this cab driver said to me, yeah, well, the Russian people don't want a democracy. The Russian people prefer a strongman, authoritarian leader. Now, that's just one cab driver's opinion. I'm not saying he's right, but it struck me. It stuck in my memory. And since we're here talking about democracy, I was curious just to ask you, Vitalik, with a Russian background, do you agree with this cab driver at all, or how do you feel?
I mean, I think in a lot of political discourse, especially there is this tendency to try to play up these indelible 1,000-year traits of civilization states or whatever. I think a lot of the time the things that drive people's thinking and decisions are much simpler than that. It's basically the pressures that they grew up with, the ideas that they have around, and things that they see and things that happened often more just within the last 30 or 50 years. And things before that, when they have influence, it's more like they have influence by being a story that everyone knows. And so I think it's definitely true that Russia has not had a successful period of being a democracy, though I think it's that's also something that was true of pretty much every country until it was not, right? And it's I spent about
that sounds like optimism.
It is, yeah. So I spent about a month in Germany, in Berlin this summer, right? And we know what happened there about a century ago, right? And before the big thing happened, there was this kind of fledgling attempt to bring democracy in that ended up being not strong enough and ended up failing, right? And there's a lot of people, there's this the Sonderweg theory, right? This theory that German culture has this special path, and it's just doomed to be sort of more authoritarian and more militaristic than others. And then you go into Berlin today, and you see graffiti everywhere advocating for peace. You see people complaining about climate change. You see the Ethereum ecosystems. One of the highest concentrations of people being concerned about things like openness and and freedom and censorship resistance. And it feels like a total complete flip, right? And so I think flips like that are absolutely possible. I absolutely hope that a flip like that comes to Russia as well.
I'm holding out hope for Russian democracy.
I'm not naive, and flips definitely don't come easily. Definitely didn't come easily to Germany either. But
no, it didn't.
Yeah.
One of my favorite sets of ideas in the Plurality book has to do with democracy as compared to kind of two other philosophies that you describe. Glen, co-writer of the book, do you want to just lay out those three?
Sure. So I think one story that you hear a lot in the mainstream is big AI in the sky is going to do everything for you. Everyone will get a universal basic income, and we'll all be fat and happy. There was a guy who ran for student council president when I was in college, who said, keep the good stuff rolling and the good times, good stuff flowing and the good times rolling while all the hard work is done by Spolin, which was his name. And I think that's kind of the attitude that, you know, you hear from the technocratic AI will do everything for you, can't. And then the other vision.
You call that one technocracy?
Technocracy. And then, you know, in this world, you hear a lot of like network state, neo-reaction, dark enlightenment, sovereign individual. All these ideas are like, we don't really need communities, we don't really need religions, we don't really need governments. We just kind of are gonna have like a big, you know, capitalist computer, every man for himself, snow crash world. And we call that libertarianism, though I'm a little uncomfortable with it because like, there's plenty of libertarians who don't really have that quite worldview. But anyways, like that like sort of hyper kind of individualist or like, you know, fractionalized, like don't want to have to deal with politics ever type of a vision. That's quite popular here, but actually I think most of the technologies we use today, the internet, personal computing, like things that have actually worked, have much more of a democratic spirit underlying them. The problem is like it's a little bit more complicated. It's like a little hard for people to articulate. And so people conceive of the future in these like really kind of like almost comically simplistic ways, just because they're easy to like memify and like, you know, get out there. And this like subtler one, which is about social diversity and relationships, which like pretty much any complexity science tells you it kind of has to be what's going on. It's a little harder to communicate, at least in the, you know, Western world where we are the simplistic things.
That's what you would call digital democracy.
Or plurality, yeah.
Or plurality. Okay, so Audrey, then, I want to hear your defense of democracy. And I will even say that as I consider myself a proponent of democracy, but I'll also admit that when election time comes and it's time for me to vote, I find myself sometimes thinking, am I really qualified to make these decisions? Like, yeah, I might have been reading a bunch of news articles about a couple of the names on this ballot, but then all these down ballot things, the local measures, the ballot initiatives, the most I'm gonna maybe spend on this is a day, and I probably won't even spend an entire day on it. Am I really qualified to do this? Is democracy actually a really good way to govern, to decide what a country's government ought to do? I'd like to hear your defense of democracy.
Sure. What you're describing really is a form of democracy that is defined by kind of very high latency, like once every 2 or 4 years, and also very small bandwidth. In the sense that you can maybe have a vote, but that's just one bit of information. If it's a referenda, if it's a selection between like 4 candidates, it's just 2 bits of information. And nowadays with the internet, we have the new kind of broad listening technologies that can let people input much more bits into the decision-making process. People can meet online, people can deliberate, people can have a real-time conversation, even calling into a hotline to have a back and forth conversation with a chatbot. All this is possible. So I think the core reason why democracy is updatable, is renewable, is that the rules that democracy itself operates in can change. So if people feel that we need a higher bandwidth democracy, people feel that we need to have participatory budgeting, have citizens initiatives, have the presidential hackathon, why not? They can just pass regulations and laws and upgrade democracy to a higher bandwidth and to a lower latency. Whereas in a kind of local optimal technocratic future, there really is no future. You're stuck in the local optimum, you call it singularity, and then foreclose possibilities to future generations. So I think democracy also helps in that there's a certain humility in it. Imbued in every democratic process, including the constitution, the legal system, is the ability to renew itself when new situations arrive. And that is what gives me hope.
So it's less of faith in democracy as I might understand it as a typical American voter, and more of faith in what democracy could be if we were to upgrade those democratic tools.
And your legal system, your constitution, your entire system is also upgradable. There is room for democratic renewal.
Yeah, and you know, I think it's not just humility with regards to the future, it's also humility with regards to other civilizations. You know, you talked about Russia. I have a student that I work with who studies Africa, and you know, there's an enormous emphasis put when you talk about democracy or autocracy on like a quite small number of features of a society that are really not like all of the ways that you could be getting input from the citizens. Like there's a big emphasis on elections. There's a big emphasis on like equal numbers of votes in those elections. And like those things are interesting, but they're like definitely not the only way you can do things. Like there are a lot of autocratic governments in Africa, for example, where you have much better representation across the lines of social divide, like tribe and gender and whatever, in the actual operation of the state, even though there are no elections. So is that better? I'm not saying it's better. That's not the point. The point is that there are like different ways to organize things. There's also something called consociationalism, which is a little bit related to this, where the notion is that you have power sharing. So you understand there are divides in societies, and you make sure that you always have in every single institution interleaving of Sunnis and Shiites and whatever. Again, is that perfect? There's problems with it, whatever. But the point is that there are different ways of doing these things, and to just be like democracy versus autocracy, like elides all of that. And we need to have the humility to look at these different systems, to draw on them, and then to like recombine them in ways that could do better than any of them.
Yeah. And it seems like a big key to what you're talking about is the ability of people to collaborate. Collaboration is something I want to touch on here. This is a big part of, I think, what drew me to this work and why I'm here is I spent a lot of time thinking about collaboration in the sphere of art and creativity with the Hit Record online community that I would do. And for those of you who've never heard of Hit Record, it's this community where people make things together. A lot of the internet is about people saying, here's what I made. Our question on Hit Record is, what can we make if we work together? And I think a big part of what inspires me about what the work you've done in Taiwan is I'm seeing some of those same principles, but on this really grand scale, and not just to make little pieces of art, but to make a democracy function. So I'd love just to hear, tell me about how the tenets of collaboration and community work in this new upgraded democracy of Taiwan, because like you said, I, as an American who is suffering through a sort of a low bandwidth and low touch democracy, I take a lot of inspiration and hope when hearing about how it works here.
Yeah, so as I mentioned in my opening, I think there is a lot to be said about making civics education, like people younger than 18, having the full capacity to already set the agenda for the society. For more than 8 years now, we have a citizens initiative platform, join.gov.tw, where anybody can get online and get 5,000 signatures. And all they need really is a SMS number. So it doesn't really check your age. And some of the most impactful petitions, like banning plastic straws from bubble tea takeouts and so on, were started by people who are younger than 18. And sometimes they even petition for their own rights. There was a couple years ago a petition by mostly high school students that says science shows that if you sleep for 1 more hour instead of study for 1 more hour, it actually gets your score better. So they petitioned to, instead of going to school on 7:30 or something, they want to go to school like 8:45 or something, right? So
you just got every high schooler's attention just now.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is backed by science, you know. And so after deliberation, actually, they succeeded, right? And so the kind of 早自习, the early attendance of the classes and so on, that was dialed back, and so people get some more sleep. Now, that is not a trivial example, actually. It is actually instilling in many people's mind before they turn 18 that this is what democracy looks like, and I have a high bandwidth input into the decision-making process. And I also want to highlight not just the government efforts, but also the civil society efforts. Like from the very—
What's the difference between government and civil society?
So the government websites are something that .gov.tw, so it's supported as public infrastructure by the government, by taxpayer money. But there are also things, for example, Vitalik briefly mentioned defense against online, like rumors and misinformation and things like that. Now, many of these are not in public places. They're actually in end-to-end encrypted channels, like in Taiwan, it's Line, but in other places, maybe WhatsApp or things like that. Now, there's a real danger if you have a government-sponsored way to look into this end-to-end encrypted chat channels and tell you that this is scam, this is phishing, and so on, because that means that the government will be able to listen in on those supposedly encrypted communications. But in Taiwan, the civil society, for example, the GovZero or G0V initiative, started this idea of COFAX or collaborative fact-checking. So it's an open source tool that you can actually use to flag any piece of information that you receive from Line into a shared dashboard. It's a little bit like flagging an incoming email as spam. And so like the spam trending, like spam house, you now have a pretty good kind of trending what is going on in the end-to-end encrypted channels so that people can collaboratively add context. It's like community notes, but works for end-to-end encrypted channels. Now there's a lot of downstream applications. There's Trend Micro, there's the Go Look, there's all sorts of different downstream applications of this shared open source common good. But the point is that this common good is built by volunteers, and therefore it is not a state surveillance or censorship apparatus.
It's so refreshing to hear about technology being used to bolster democracy, because at this point, it feels to me like in the West and the dominant tech companies coming out of the West, they're undermining democracy more than they're contributing to it. So that brings me to, I want to talk today about social media and sort of the way social media is. I'm someone who used to have nothing but love for social media. It made me extremely optimistic, speaking of optimism. I felt like everybody being able to have a voice, everybody being able to connect with each other, this could only lead to good things. And now, years later, it feels like social media has, I know just my personal experience of it is when I spend any time looking at Instagram or Twitter or YouTube or any of these sites, I usually come away feeling worse about myself and about the world. I'm curious just for all three of you, what's your sort of lived experience when you use social media? How do you feel? How does it go for you?
How was my lived experience using social media? It's I mean, okay, so back in 2014, when Twitter was still very small, and it definitely felt incredibly useful and incredibly productive. Sometime around 2020, it started to become hard for me to say anything, because anytime I would say something, there would be like 10 people making those scams that are like, hey, yeah, send me 5 ETH, I'll give you 10 ETH back. Then a bit, and then a bit later in 2022, what would happen was I would make a tweet that just talks about anything, and then people would just seize on any one word in my tweet, and then they would make a meme coin out of it, right? And so at some point, I ended up making this tweet that just said, hey, maybe someone should just make a coin called the protocol, so that anytime I say pretty much anything, they could pretend that I'm shilling them, and that someone actually did that. And then the most recent thing that happened, of course, is getting publicly canceled for wearing a mask on an airplane, and trying. So, there's all kinds of people there that are really fun characters, but you know, in terms of like the actual quality of interactions that I get, I mean, I think like so revealed preference, you know, there is a reason I make a point of like publishing at least one thing every month on my blog, and like that, like whenever, like basically, yeah, whenever I have something strong to say, whenever I find myself phrasing it in the form of a tweet, like I would just often end up regretting it 24 or 48 hours later. But whenever I end up writing it as a blog post and like I actually get more chance to like express, I mean, like what is, like what's my underlying reasoning here? Like even if lots of people disagree, I end up not regretting it, right? And so, yeah, like I think there's, you know, there's definitely something to, you know, like the deep format, and I think there's a lot of issues that, you know, like transcend whether like some particular thing is being controlled by Jack Dorsey or Elon or whoever else, and there's still a lot of room to like really try to improve and like figure out you know, like what actually is something that's I mean, one frame is like what is something that would be useful for like yourself as an individual, right? Like I'm always a big fan of asking questions about yourself because I think it's good to like take people out of, you know, like abstract far mode and like thinking about, you know, like ideologies and like you know, you talk about like democracy and truth and you know, like freedom of speech and so on, and it's really like, you know, you're pointing and clicking out little symbols in your head and like into the realm of like, you know, your life experience, like what's good for you, right? And like one frame is the personal, the other frame I think is also like what's good for your community, right? And like thinking of communities as being customers of these platforms, I think is also a valuable thing, right? And so I sometimes think about like what even would be, you know, an ideal set of platforms for, you know, like say the Ethereum community to have better discourse in. I mean, right now I think I'm happy that we're entering into this phase where we're kind of I feel like we're exiting this kind of global water cooler era, and you know, we're entering an era where there's like more different groups of people trying different things, and we can actually start to see what comes out of that. And like I'm hopeful that the you know, the pressures that determine you know, like what rises to the top and what falls to the bottom between platforms are healthier than the dynamics that happens within one.
I want to get to the interoperability of platforms, but so just lived experience on social media?
Yeah, I brought my laptop just to show this. So I sincerely recommend to you this browser extension called the Newsfeed Eradicator. If you install this extension, you can replace the homepage, the feed of Facebook, Instagram, Twitter X, YouTube, LinkedIn, Reddit, Y Combinator News, or whatever, into this simple quote. So whenever I go to x.com, I see nothing. And I just see an inspiring quote. In this case, it says, "Muddy water is best cleared by leaving it alone." It's very good.
I'm going to think of that quote every
defensive
time I'm tempted to open Twitter from now
technology,
on.
right?
Muddy water is best cleared by leaving it alone.
That's DX.
Right, that's defensive accelerationism. And so it's still useful, right? Like when people tag me, when people mention me by name, I can still engage and respond. But the feed is gone, and therefore the addiction part is gone. I can find like no positive externalities to others or to myself for this default feed mechanism for all of these so-called social media, but really anti-social feed platforms. So I just eradicated them all. Sincerely recommended. Newsfeed Eradicator.
Newsfeed Eradicator. I might do that. Yeah. All right. Glen, lived experience on social media?
You know, mixed, and it's changed over time. And it's very heterogeneous across different pockets. You know, whenever I interact with the crypto world and Vitalik in particular, I would say that like 98% of stuff that comes through is scams, like maybe things that have some element of pornography to them. Just like, we're just really not great stuff. But about 1% is like really great stuff, you know, and really intellectual and interesting. when I interact with like you, Joe, who is like a similar profile to Vitalik, like I get a lot of sort of generally kind of like good vibey type stuff, and then there's other people, you know, where I get some like pretty aggressive, mean stuff, and
It is.
fighting,
It's a mixed
and
bag.
it's
Yeah,
just
for
it kind of depends. But I would
So
say,
Glenn, when are you going to pump the price of ETH?
exactly. So, but I do think that the ratio of stuff that I enjoyed to stuff that is sort of like, you know, just like not very relevant went up like maybe by 1 to 2 orders of magnitude when Elon took over X.
Yeah.
So, and it's not even like, you know, oh, it's like racist, or I mean, forget about it. Just like not relevant or interesting or reaching the people that I want to reach or being reached. So like investment in like the technology seems to matter. Like if you fire 90% of the staff, like it has some effect on the quality of the product.
So we were talking about democracy earlier, and I think democracy and social media have a lot to do with each other. You know, where I'm from in the U.S., one of the presidential candidates is still to this day running on a lie that he won the election in 2020. And there's no evidence to support this, but through social media and maybe other means, but I think it's largely propagated by social media, this lie is believed by a big chunk of the country, and it's I think it's a big force undermining democracy. I'm curious to hear about how you think what's a better way for social media to interact with democracy? Like how could it work such that, I know you described some of these things in the way that civil society goes, so maybe you've sort of already answered this, but is there any way where we can have a social media that is going to help democracy?
Yeah, as I mentioned, the pro-social parts of social media is what we have been experimenting in Taiwan. If you sort not by engagement or the time you're going to spend on such a post, but rather sort by constructiveness, by curiosity, by other pro-social attributes, then you're going to feel much better than compared to the default sorting mechanism. And also there's research that shows that actually the time you spend does not decrease, so it doesn't really hurt the business model. It just leaves people's quality of life better. Now, the question why the existing mainstream social media do not already switch to those more pro-social sorting mechanisms, mostly was just because they don't have to, right? When you said that social media gave many people a voice, I would also argue that the mainstream social media did not give them a choice. If you get a post on a video platform, it can only really be consumed on that video platform, which comes with its own recommendation algorithm. There currently is no easy way for me to say that my For You feed need to be like more constructive, more curious, and things like that, and construct a very different feed, a very different experience, but based on the same posts. So like this is actually quite unnatural. If you think about, say, podcasts, you can post it anywhere, and then you can view it, subscribe it, or even remix it if there's Creative Commons using different experiences designed by different people. But at this moment, there really is no choice. If you get posts in one particular siloed platform, you cannot really interoperate and curate a different experience from another recommendation layer. And so this kind of separation between the post and also how you curate it, how you recommend it, and so on, this is the choice layer that needs to happen.
So you're getting into what I want to talk about next, which is if we zoom in a bit on one particular social media platform, TikTok. So in the US, as I imagine a lot of you know, a law was passed that will compel TikTok to either divest, meaning sell itself to a US company, or be banned. And this is big news in the United States, especially amongst the tons and tons and tons of people who really like using TikTok. Some people see this as a good thing. Some people think that TikTok is a threat to national security, and this is why this law is important to pass. There are other people who feel like this law is just an attempt of the US government to suppress free speech. And Audrey, you've recently joined as an advisor, a senior fellow to an organization called Project Liberty, which is putting forward this people's bid to acquire TikTok, not as just another business, but as an effort to make a more positive version of what a social network could be. I found this really interesting, especially when they brought you on. So I'm curious what you think of the TikTok divestment in the US. I mean, I guess I have a couple questions about this, but first of all, does it make sense to you, this law that was passed? If given the choice, like, yes, it is a threat to national security, and it's a good idea that TikTok is facing this ban, or no, this is just the US government trying to suppress free speech. I'm curious, where do you come down on that? What's your opinion of the TikTok divestiture?
Well, I mean, when I served as digital minister, we also have a Cybersecurity Management Act. I think the draft is now out of the executive branch, is in the legislative branch now, in which we use exactly the same definition, that any app that is de facto remote controlled by foreign adversaries, even indirectly, it would be classified as harmful product. And I think we did that like long ago, like 4 years ago or something. And so like in the basic education systems and in public sector certainly and so on, we do not allow such harmful products. And so
why is it harmful for us?
Because it's remote controlled. So basically, through those very opaque recommendation algorithms, there is a opportunity for remote controlling what gets trendy, what does not, what gets voice, what does not. And there is no transparency or not even a kind of choice, right, in choosing such recommendation algorithms.
Can I put it another way, Joe? So there's a wonderful paper by Gary King, Jin Pan, and Molly Roberts about how censorship works near here. And what it says is that actually the impression that censorship and the Great Firewall are the main effect is just not borne out in the data. That actually the main thing that is used to stop coordination among civil society is attacks that whenever there's an event or other thing that might rally people, that there are people who are paid to go into that forming community and to divide it along some other line.
Paid by whom?
By
Good
those who
question.
want to sow discord and
Yes.
polarization.
Yeah.
And so the point I'm making here is that the people's bid, as I understand it, is fundamentally about choice. So it's not about, telling TikTok creators that these are now, this kind of strict guidelines. You can only create along these things. It's not about putting a limit on what people can express. It is about freeing those creators' kind of direct reach to the people who follow them. It is also about freeing the curation of alternate ways to get engagements so that if I want to learn about science, if I want to learn about education, if I want to explore a co-creation, collaboration together, and so on, I can choose a kind of curation, a recommendation engine that is steerable. I think the steerability is fundamentally at odds with this remote control monolith algorithm. And so the main idea of People's Bid really is to put the steerability of choice and voice and also a sense of stake, kind of like cooperative, back to the creator and the community around this creator.
So just to reiterate, so you're saying that if the people's bid to acquire TikTok were to succeed, that users of TikTok could change their own feed, could say they could be deciding what comes up on the For You page.
You can just talk to your For You feed and steer it the way you want. Or if you don't like how the feed looks at all and prefer a feed eradicator or something, then there could be like third-party viewers, third-party experiences that builds upon the same posts.
You would have more choice in that way. And you also said, as I think this is important for the creator community, that if the people's bid were to succeed in acquiring TikTok, creators on TikTok would be able to actually reach their followers more.
Right, exactly. Instead of through a single intermediary that has its kind of own rules of how much you can contact them. You can actually cultivate like alternate communities and not be restrained by the format of the like main feed or the main post or the addiction or things like that. You can, for example, cultivate this long form back and forth conversations or a community based on remixes like Hit Record.
And so thanks for the shout out. So and so if people would want a version of TikTok like that, what can they do to try to make that actually happen?
Yeah, I think one way is just to set a norm, right? To let the people, like the representatives, if you're in the US, or the journalists or the technical community, know that there is now such a possibility to decouple the posting and the curation. There's now such a possibility to work in a decentralized way. And it doesn't have to be any particular technology. I mean, it could be Farcaster, Lens Protocol, Nostr, DSMP, whatever. But if you're already experiencing this Mastodon, this federated Fediverse, you can also spread the word. Or if you're on Threads.net by Meta, there's also an option that says your new post can go to the Fediverse. And so everybody can participate in this federated universe and therefore make it much more rich.
So this is that interoperability that you mentioned before. Just to reiterate this, you're saying then that if you were to post something on TikTok, it would live not just on TikTok. It could be seen through all these other kind of open platforms as opposed to just in one walled garden.
That's the idea of interoperability, yes.
I mean, that would really change how social media is, because the whole thing about why we all kind of would like to get off Twitter, but we can't because everyone's there. But if things were interoperable, like you're talking about, those network effects, the thing that traps us all there would get weakened a lot. Is that what you're saying?
And I also think it offers an opportunity for innovation along the lines of things like community notes. So, you know, community notes and Polis, they sound complicated, you know, or innovative, but really they're a very old idea. You said that this is the worst moment for US democracy. Well, actually, US media was much more polarized actually than it is now in the period leading up to World War II. And then after World War II, basically the media got scared that it was all going to be nationalized because it was viewed as so problematic for democracy. And so there was something called the Hutchins Commission out of the University of Chicago. And what they said is like two basic principles, objectivity and fairness. What does that mean? It really is just the principles of Polis. You're supposed to only report as news things that are widely agreed to across different perspectives. And you're supposed to, when things are not widely agreed, show the different perspectives. Very, very, very simple doctrine. Initially, just corporate social responsibility, eventually, in many ways, written into US law for certain applications. And that's just what Polis does. Now, we have
it's not very good for a advertising model that makes so much money for Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, et cetera.
Yeah, it wasn't great for the advertising model of the people in the 1940s, but they were concerned about ensuring the freedom of the press. And so I think this notion that the freedom of the press just depends on let the person who is able to come up with the most addictive thing grab the most land and use their money to defend their position, that's like the definition of the freedom of the press. It's not particularly consistent with like the history of the freedom of the press in Western society. Like it actually depends on having some notion of like what gets reach and what is the system by which things get reach. I mean, speech is free, but reach is expensive. And if you let like people who just want to sow discord do a DDoS attack on the system, and that's considered to be like freedom of speech, like that's not really going to get you where you want to go.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're almost out of time. I want to do a lightning round just to take us out. I thought you've spoken about how this year is historic for democracy because more people will vote in democratic elections this year than at any other time in history. Do I have that right? So for this year, I'm curious to just kind of a quick version to hear from all three of you. I want to hear a worst case scenario and then I want to hear a best case scenario. So worst case scenarios first. Vitalik, you want to go first? What's your worst case scenario for this next year?
I mean, honestly, World War III escalation, right? Because, if you think about the run up to World War II, like stuff actually started happening all the way back in 1931. And it's, basically what, the thing that people call the start of the war was only, when things, like the world was already burning for 2 years and just everything merged together. So that's like the worst outcome that can happen of any type of polarization, right? And if that happens, then any of these efforts to bridge different groups and countries together are going to become harder. Any attempts to protect people's freedom is going to become harder because that's always probably the third casualty of war right after truth and actual casualties. So that a lot of downsides there. And I think on the flip side, stuff that we're working on, I think if done
We're
right.
going to do best case scenario after because I want to go out on a high note. Right?
Worst case scenario, Harris narrowly wins the election, and crypto money and crypto community lead an armed insurrection against the government.
Okay, that was not what I expected. Okay. Worst case scenario. I hope you guys applauding aren't thinking of that as the best case scenario. All right.
Get a round of applause, everybody.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Much thanks to Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Glen, Weyl, Vitalik Buterin, and
Wow.
Audrey Tang with
That's
a
a sign
Symphony
from our
Open
moderator.
Minds.
We didn't get to do the best case scenario.